Welcome to ArtSpot Online, where we learn about a current exhibition at the Tampa Museum of Art and then make something inspired by it. Today we're going to look at some paintings from the current exhibition, Living Color, the Art of the Highwaymen. The Highwaymen are a group of African American artists celebrated for their distinctive paintings of Florida's natural environment. Working in and around the Fort Pierce area beginning in the 1950s, these self-taught artists made paintings of the state's scenic coastline and wild backcountry, often in dazzling combinations of color and tone. Brilliant tropical sunsets, wind-blown palms, towering sunlit clouds, and blooming poinciana trees are among the many subjects that have become iconic images of Florida, and in part because of the paintings that the Highwaymen created. Unrecognized in their time by the region's existing art establishment of galleries and museums, the Highwaymen, by necessity, catered directly to the people who enjoyed their work. They sold their paintings door to door along such thoroughfares as Route 1 to an enthusiastic audience of new Florida residents. This is how they got their nickname, the Highwaymen. Something you'll often notice in paintings by the Highwaymen is that you can see the individual brushstrokes that make up each painting, and those brushstrokes look like they were painted fast. Oftentimes, they were. Descriptive details are minimized, and instead, the artists emphasize mood and atmosphere with broad tones of color and quick gestural brushwork. The brushstrokes are gestural, meaning that these things that you recognize from nature are suggested with a few rapid strokes of color applied with a brush or palette knife loaded up with paint. Sometimes the paintings will have slower, more deliberate marks like this, but often they'll have gestural marks like this. Sometimes both are even in the same painting, but it's this gestural mark making that helps to create this electric energy that you often see in these landscape paintings. The Highwaymen can make paintings like this relatively quickly, which allowed them to make a lot of paintings in a short amount of time, but it's these fast and forceful marks that make their scenes of nature more abstract and exciting, and give the paintings the feeling of life and energy. Not just recreating a picture of something beautiful you could see in nature, but also making visible for us the power and the forces of nature. Right, the color is alive. So today we're going to use some techniques and ideas based on some close looking at some paintings by the Florida Highwaymen to make a painting of the Florida landscape, and we're going to do it fast. Couple disclaimers up top. This will be a little different from the other art spots in that it'll take longer to follow along step by step. But if you end up liking these more real-time, longer instruction videos, you can go to tampamuseum.org/home studio, where we currently have a couple different art projects based on art in the museum that includes all the supplies that you'll need to complete them, and they'll take a lot longer and you can work along with me in real time. And new ones are being added all the time, so check it out. Lastly, my finished painting might look hard to do at first, but stick with it, and you'll finish with a unique painting that you actually like. Your painting will and actually should look different from mine, and there are only 5 basic elements. There's the clouds, the horizon, the water, trees, and the foreground. And there are tons and tons of different ways that a painting can look right with those ingredients. So as we go along, don't stress about following me exactly. If you take it one piece at a time like I'm doing it, it'll be great. It might look awkward along the way, but so will mine. That's normal. It's how painting works. It won't look right till we're finished. So stick with it. Don't sweat it. Let's go. Most of the Florida Highwaymen paintings are on a thin particle board, so very smooth, very cheap material. So really find anything to paint on. I'm just gonna do mine on a straight up piece of cardboard, just cut off of a box from a delivery. The only thing I would suggest is to make sure that it's longer than it is tall. But other than that, anything flat will do. As for the paints themselves, just gather some paints that kind of look like this. And you could use whatever colors you wanted. If you don't have the same colors that I do, just try to use colors that are around the same value, right? Colors that have around the same lightness or darkness. That's going to be way more important than the actual colors that you use, is the value of the colors. Tempera works too. If it's too see-through, you can just mix in a little bit of your white. Watercolor won't work for this, but if you do want a watercolor project, just let me know in the comments and we'll see what I can do. And then lastly, we're just going to use one brush. I know I'm being really loosey-goosey about the materials, but really try and find a flat brush like this that's kind of a square shape that's around this size. If you're using a smaller panel than I am to paint on, try to use a smaller brush. If you're using a bigger panel than I am, try and use a slightly wider brush. And grab a palette knife. If you don't have one of these, just grab a butter knife or a plastic knife. We're only gonna use it for a couple marks at the very end. And then just get a paper plate or just whatever you have as a palette. You can just get a piece of wax paper. You can put your paint on that. You can just get a actual like ceramic plate and put your paint on that. Paper plates are fine too. Paper plates will absorb some of the paint and it'll dry out, but we're making this painting super duper fast. So you don't need a really fancy palette for this. All right, to get started, we're gonna prime our panel. So I'm just taking my extra house paint that I have here. Make sure that it's acrylic or latex, really anything except oil, just because that's gonna be a little more toxic and take a lot longer to dry. So but whatever light extra paint that you have, use that to prime your panel. So if you'll notice, I got a decent amount of paint on my brush and I'm going side to side, right? You can see all the brush strokes are kind of going left to right and they're all horizontal. Once that's fully covered and dried, you can use a hair dryer to speed up that process. But once it's dried, you then want to go up and down, right? So the direction of the brush strokes are, what's the word? Perpendicular to each other. So it'll just help you get more even coverage with less amount of work. And the whole point of doing this is, it adds this layer of protection to the cardboard, which isn't super strong, but the paint will just stick to it easier. It'll be just easier to paint on. If you painted on the plain cardboard, it would kind of get absorbed. It would be harder to do all of these separate, distinct brush strokes that you'll see in a lot of Highwaymen paintings. So it'll help make this painting out of all of these individual brush strokes, but also it'll just make our colors brighter because most of the paint is going to be a little bit see-through. So you'll have this brighter, lighter background and it'll make the colors look brighter and it'll be easier for you to control and mix the colors that you want to use. They'll look similar on your white paper plate that you're mixing on to what they'll look like on the panel. So speaking of those colors, right, these are the ones I mentioned earlier. And as I said before, you don't need the exact ones. You just want to make sure they're about the same lightness or darkness. And you really need a little bit, like half of what I have here is plenty. All right, so we're going to start by establishing our horizon line. And we're going to do that by mixing a kind of basic sky color. So I'm taking my dark blue. This is a phthalo blue, so it's really dark, a little bit green. And I'm mixing in some white, and I just grabbed a little bit of my medium yellow color to brighten it up a little bit, to sort of give it, so you get this subtle feeling like there's kind of sunshine going through it. It'll just look like more like a sunny natural sky than if you were to just mix the white and the dark blue together. But you see I'm all scooping it all together. And you'll notice I'm only getting little bits of blue at a time because the blue is really strong because it's really dark. So here we go. We're going to establish the horizon line, and you'll see I put my hand on there basically to divide it into thirds. And I'm making my horizon line on that bottom third. And now I'm going to sketch the outline of my clouds. We can be really messy, right? This is all going to get covered up with more and more paint. This is just again, an outline. And you'll notice the clouds, right? They're not like arcs that are symmetrical. They're kind of leaning to the side, right? So whatever organic bloopy shapes that you make for your clouds, you just want to make sure that it is kind of leaning like that, right? That's going to give the picture a more of a sense of movement and motion, which will, again, it'll make it seem more natural and alive. So now I'm just filling in with that same sky color, painting over those outlines that I just made, right? So now we no longer have this outline cloud shape, right? We just have these white fluffy shapes on this blue background. And it's okay if you go outside the lines. we're going to cover up that white area with more paint. So keep everything really fast, really loose. We can always go back and fix stuff. As long as the paint is dried, you can just paint right over anything you end up not liking. But for something like this, it's much better to just let those brush strokes live. Okay, so we skipped ahead a little bit, but I filled in some of the ocean, right, with that same sky color. And I did it with just these really big, broad, side-to-side brush strokes. Again, we're keeping everything really messy right now. Just trust that eventually it'll all come together. All right, so now I didn't even clean my brush. I left that little bit of blue in there, and then I dunked pretty heavily into just the plain white. And you'll see that I'm doing this kind of scribbly, spirally motion so that I get these twirling brush strokes, right, to make this seem more like dense and more fluffy. And you'll notice I started on the outside, right, kind of the edges of the clouds, and then I'm working my way closer to the horizon line. Yeah, don't forget about this little cloud here. You'll see I kind of forgot about him. But still, right, just dunking in the white, using that little bit of blue that's already in my brush so that you have these streaks of different colors, which will give it a little bit more dimension. Do make sure that you don't swirl around too much in one area for too long. You'll see I'm kind of moving and swirling. So swirl in some brush strokes and move along, right? The more you swirl it around, the more it's just going to become one color, right? We don't want the colors to mix fully. So again, I skipped ahead a little bit, but I basically did the same process with just a tiny bit of my purple mixed into the white. And then I left the edges brighter and whiter, right? I kind of let those be. But I filled all the lower parts with, again, this very, very light purple. And then on top of that, I mixed in a tiny bit of my orange in there. Again, doing that same process of just scribbling around and letting the outer edges stay lighter than the parts that are closer to the horizon. And then we're going to finish up these clouds by adding some white and some of my dark yellow. And we're going to do a couple more of these light swirly marks on those outer edges of the clouds. Right, these are the ones that have most exposure to direct sunlight, so they're going to be brighter. And having these, outer edges being a little bit lighter and more golden, and the insides being a little bit darker and a little more purpley and blue, it'll make them seem more three-dimensional and more fluffy. And you'll see, right, I'm not blending, I'm just scribbling here and there and moving along, right? We want to be able to see all those brush strokes. Going back in here, adding a little bit of a random kind of darker blue-gray to the bottom of that cloud because it was all too much one color, right? Like I just said, you want kind of lighter on the top, darker on the bottom. So I went back, made it a little darker on the bottom. So now we're going to go back into the water and just like before, big, broad brush strokes left to right. We want to kind of adjust this color so that it's a little bit more close to the color of the clouds. So meaning we just want to get a little bit more purple in there, a little bit more white. And then we're going to go make a bunch of these waves. So just picking up a little bit of white and using just the tip of the brush, doing a bunch of these long, wavy, wiggly marks that overlap one another. All right, so now I'm going to mix a light green to create some land that's way off on the other side of this bay or whatever. So I took that, we have this really dark green, right? But then we have our medium green, like our medium dark green. And so we mix that with some white to create a kind of lighter and kind of more gray green. And I'm just using, just like we did with the waves, just the top of the brush so that you have a much skinnier line. And just, just tracing over the horizon line like I had before, and then just letting the brush kind of wander to create a more hilly, irregular, land mass off in the horizon. All right, now I'm finally, for the first time, rinsing off the brush a little bit. So I'm just swirling it around in an old cup with some water. And you want to make sure that you wipe it off really well, too, because there's going to be some paint that's kind of down there in the bristles. So now we want to mix like a really dark green to kind of outline the foreground and our basic palm tree shapes. So I'm just mixing my dark green with my dark blue, and I'm using that top edge of my brush, just the tip of the brush, to create just any regular, basically random, lazy, meandering, kind of up and down for my foreground. Just like all the other sections, we're going to build up on this layer by layer, so you don't want to overthink this shape. You just want to make sure that it's irregular, that it's not symmetrical, and that all the lines are kind of wavy. So I'm just filling it in. You really don't need to worry about how you're applying the paint. We just want a dark shape to kind of work with, to build on top of layer. Now we're going to establish where our palm trees are going to end, where the tops of our trunks are going to be. So each dot represents the top of one of our palm trees, and I'm going to use the top edge of my brush to make just a lazy, slow, curvy line for each of the trunks. You can really just, use your imagination. The only thing you want to pay attention to is the width of them. You want to make sure they're a little bit wider at the bottom than they are at the top. And you want to make sure that they're all going in different directions. Even if you make your trees more straight, less curvy, that's fine. Just try to make them all a little bit different. So now I'm just going to go back and I'm going to widen them a little bit now that I know the direction that I want them to go. And like I said before, right, use this as an opportunity to double check and make sure that they're all different, and to make sure that the trunk is a little bit wider at the bottom than it is at the top. Just a little bit. You don't want it to look like, bell-bottom jeans or whatever, or Jinkos. All right, so I'm not even cleaning the brush. I'm just wiping it off to get all that extra paint out, because that'll make the tip of the brush extra crispy and extra fine. So now we're going to do like the skeleton of the leaves, right? So these are going to be kind of the main branches that our palm leaves are all going to hang off of. And I would follow this same basic structure that I'm doing here. I'm actually going to put up a diagram so that we can do the same structure for every palm tree. But you'll see this, they're curving in different directions, right? And we're going to repeat that for all of them. So that curves up and to the left, right? This one's kind of up towards like 11 o'clock. This one's like at 1 o'clock. This one's at like 2 o'clock. This one kind of curves down and then up, right? And then you have one that's almost straight across. Oh, I skipped it there. Well, this is a little more of a dense area. So yeah, let's pause. Let's fully finish one of these palm trees. But again, we're going to do the same basic structure. So don't just go straight down like this on all of your palm fronds. Like, this looks fine. But in the same way that we paid attention to the direction of the branch, we want to do the same thing for the leaves, right? So leaves kind of curve down and to the right, and then they go kind of straight, and then they start curving the other direction, right? You guys see that? And this one will be a little different. Like, these are all going to curve up and to the right, right? They kind of go straight out to the right. This one, they're going to curve out and down a little bit. Out and down, just like before, just smaller. These kind of curve, right, they're kind of more U-shaped. This one's really U-shaped too. Right, the curve of each leaf is like a U. Right, so down and to the left. These go down and to the right, right? And then they slowly turn into straight down ones, and then they curve sort of up and to the left. Such a little thing, right? It's just a basic brush stroke that we're doing over and over again, but we're just varying the direction of it and which way it curves just slightly. But that little bit of a difference makes it look so much more natural versus just like a stick with lines pointing straight out. Like, having these little curves that subtly change direction each time not only makes it feel more natural, but you do get a stronger sense of like the wind blowing through the leaves too. So things are going to get kind of bananas if you clustered your trees like this, but that's great. Like it's going to look really messy at first, and it's going to, you might even lose track of like what branch belongs to which trunk, but that's fine. Like that's how these things look in nature. So just keep going. Again, it'll look kind of bananas, but we need this underlying dark structure before we do our brighter brush strokes on top of it. But hopefully the diagram helps you not get lost, right? Like I keep saying, just trust that it'll eventually look right. It's going to look weird until, basically the last step. That's normal. But if you don't make paintings a lot of the time, but if you don't make a lot of paintings, you might not be used to that. So don't worry. It'll look weird, but that's totally normal. Okay, so I'm gonna wipe off my brush again. You really don't need to wash it. I'm just wiping it off so that it becomes pointy, and so I can get sharper lines, just like I did before. So now we're gonna start to layer in some of these fast brush strokes of color. So we're gonna start with that medium yellow color, and we're just basically tracing over the exact same lines that we did before. Not completely perfectly covering each one, right? But you want to make sure that they're about the same size, and you definitely want to make sure they're going the same direction, right, as the leaves that we did earlier. Don't fully cover them though, right? Like you want to obviously leave some of those earlier colors showing. And we're applying it just like we did before, using the top edge of the brush. And I would really force yourself to go fast, because you won't overthink it. And we have this underlying structure that we're adding these to, so you don't have to be careful. You can just be like, okay, I have leaves. Let me zip zap some of these yellow highlights on top of what I already have. Something I haven't mentioned yet, but I actually have a really light touch doing this, right? And that'll help you go fast as well, right? If you don't mash it in there. So that's something that's maybe not obvious if you're just looking at this, but everything I've done today has been with a really light touch. You don't need to push down hard at all. So now we're doing the same thing, but with our medium green color, right? And another reason why you want to do this fast is like you want to make sure that yellow is still a little bit wet, right? So that the color can blend in with it a little bit. But everything should just be individual brush strokes, right? Don't linger in one area for too long, right? Brush stroke, move, brush stroke, move, brush stroke, move. All right, so now we're going to, still not cleaning my brush. I'm just gonna leave that yellow and that green that's still in there. And you can see I'm just kind of mixing around the white to get a really light yellow-green. And we're gonna do the same thing. I'm probably not gonna do as many of these as the other ones, because these are just gonna be the like absolutely kind of brightest branches, right? So you can sort of see, right? There are areas that are lighter and areas that are darker. We're gonna kind of just really carefully select here and there a couple branches to just highlight and stand out from the other ones a little more strongly. And I'm just doing that on these areas that already just kind of ended up being lighter. Don't get too hung up on like light and shadow, like, which ones are more directly facing the sunlight, which ones are kind of in shadow. You really just want kind of an organic distribution of light and dark. Don't worry about the underlying physics of it. Just kind of make sure it's balanced out, right? That you have some light, some medium, and some dark. So now we're going to use that same color and do some highlights on the trees. And here we are going to pay a little bit of attention just because it's easier to do so. You can sort of tell, right? There are going to be areas in the middle and at the top. They're going to be darker, right? Because the leaves are going to be putting them in the shade. So these parts of the trees closer to the bottom, I'm just dabbling in some of that light yellow that we just used on the leaves. Just little chunks, right? Using the top of the brush, basically changing the angle of the brush so that it matches the angle of the trunks, right? So as the trunk kind of twists, you twist your brush to kind of trace it. All right, so I'm just wiping it off to get that light color out, and now I'm using the top edge of the brush again to make these kind of dagger brush strokes with that medium green. Again, make sure you don't blend. You just want to do individual brush strokes that, they overlap each other, but, you want to be able to see those those kind of like daggers of grass. And you'll notice, just like the clouds too, right? They're not going straight up and down. They're all kind of leaning to the right. Again, that'll give you a sense of air and energy and movement. It's a little thing. Like all these things we've been doing, it's just one of many little things that helps make the overall scene seem a little bit more, alive, right? Like the stuff is always moving in real life, right? And growing and, reacting to the weather. So just something as simple as kind of having things at a diagonal like that helps show that. So now, again, not cleaning the brush, just dipping into my medium yellow color, doing the same kinds of brush strokes right on top of the green ones. Again, right, you can see I'm going really quick. I have a really light touch. Doing that same thing where they're kind of leaning off to, what is that, maybe like 2 o'clock, right, up and to the right. You can see they have little curves too, right? Sometimes they're more straight, sometimes there's a little bit of a curve to it. And obviously, right, you should be looking at your painting 90% of the time, right? And when you're trying to make decisions on where to put stuff, look at your painting, right? Like you're just gonna know by looking at it, like, okay, this area seems too dark, let me add more light. Or, like let me make the grass higher here and lower there, because, your trees are all gonna be different, your background's gonna be different. Definitely look at your painting to use as a guide, right? For like where to actually put this stuff. But just like the leaves, right? You just want a balance of light and dark. Don't worry too much about like, where the light source is. This is much more about, this kind of abstract collection of colors that are in balance with each other. So now just to kind of finish it off, you can make some extra really quick marks with your palette knife or your butter knife. You just scoop a little bit onto the tip and then make the same kind of quick dagger strokes. But because it's like a hard object, you can go really fast, but the paint won't travel as far as it would if you're using a brush. So in this weird way, it kind of captures energy and speed really well compared to a brush. Because again, you can go really quick and make like a really big gesture with your arm where you're kind of shooting the paint across. But because it's a metal thing that can only carry the paint so far, right? Not as far as bristles in a brush. You can only carry the paint so far. So you'll get these short marks, but there'll be a lot of energy and there'll be a lot of speed and motion to them. So you'll see I kind of copied my highlights here and there. Now I'm going into the dark areas here and there. Again, let things be raggedy like that, right? It's like initially I was kind of like, ooh, that looks a little messy. And you'll see there's going to be one area where I'm like, oh, that's a little too messy. But there she is. But it's like, you want that action, right? You want that messiness, right? Not all over the place, but, we're selectively picking out some areas where it's like, okay, we can have these extra little like explosions of color and energy. Let's not forget about our little lonely tree over here. Like I've been saying, definitely don't overblend, don't overdo it, right? One brush stroke at a time. You don't want them to blend into each other too much. You want to be able to identify like every human action, every human gesture that put this thing together. Even in the sky, right? It's kind of hard to see in this photo, but it's, when you zoom in on it, you can see the end of the brush strokes, right? That all mushed together to make that sky. It looks kind of just like a flat color from back here, but those brush strokes are everywhere. All right, gang, that's it. I hope you had fun, and thank you for learning and making with the Tampa Museum of Art. If you liked this video, make sure you click the thumbs up and subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you don't miss the next art spot. And I'll see you next time.